morning, everybody. Good to see you all this morning. Today we are finishing up our series on Judges, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Today is definitely the ugly, if you can call one part of it the ugly. But before we jump into the text, I just wanted to ask you a question. Are you rested or restless? Do you find yourself, when people ask you how you're doing, answering, "Oh, I'm good, but just tired"? Do you think that like a low-grade exhaustion is kind of the normal for you? Can you resonate maybe with some of these experiences of mine? One of them being, whenever I'm driving here from my house on King Street, the speed limit is 60, which is a perfectly fine speed to go. And I usually leave to have plenty of time to get here. I don't have set hours, I'm not in a rush, but every time someone's not going like at least 70, I'm like, come on, why are you going so slow? I'm restless for no reason. What's going on with that? Another experience of mine, when I was in school for 4 years, I often found that every single time there was a break, like whether it was reading week or the little lull between final papers and exams or the break after a semester, I always got sick. It's like every time without fail. It's like my body had just been working and working and working, and then it was like, okay, you've got a break now, time to just like go and rest. And it was like, I wasn't listening to my body and it had to just take over, right? So maybe you can resonate with some of those experiences. It seems to kind of be a normal thing in our culture where we're getting everything fast, everything instant, everyone's working all the time, that we kind of struggle to find rest. And most of us, if we're honest, I think are restless. And so today I just want you to hold that question in your mind as we turn to Judges 17 to 21, some pretty grim chapters in the Bible, but we're gonna take more of a forest view at these than a tree view, like the pun there. I didn't mean to do that, but there we go. We're gonna look at the forest more than the trees, and just do a brief scan kind of this from a few different levels. But before we jump into those chapters in particular, I just wanted to reframe where Judges is falling, sort of in the bigger picture of the entire story of the Bible. So start off with Genesis 1 through 11. We have this picture of God as the creator king. He brings the whole cosmos into existence. He appoints humanity as his partners to help govern the world into increasing flourishing. Of course, humanity rebels. They decide that they want to do what's good in their own eyes. They want to seize autonomy for themselves. They don't want to just be images of God. They want to be like gods themselves. This rebellion results in exile. The world falls into chaos. Things are just on a downward spiral until chapter 11. It all culminates in the Tower of Babel. Things aren't looking very good. How are they going to be fixed? Don't worry, God has a plan. Genesis 12, 1 through 3, he calls this guy named Abram, and he says that I think we're on slide perfect, all right. He says that he is going to be a blessing to the nations. So we've got this quote is God talking to Abraham. He says to him, "Go from your country and your people and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great and be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and those who dishonor you I will curse. And in you all the peoples on earth shall be blessed." So we have this plan that God has. Somehow he's going to use Abraham and his family, not just to bless them, like it's not just, oh, you're the elect people, I'm going to save you, but it's like through you, the whole world is going to be blessed. Everything's going to be set right again. Fast forward a little bit to Exodus 19:6. We have the people of Israel, Abraham's family at Mount Sinai, many generations later, and they're making a covenant, an agreement with God about being this nation that's going to be a blessing to all the other nations. And God says to them that they're going to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So this means that they are going to be set apart. They're going to be holy for a particular purpose that God has for them. And that as an entire kingdom, they're going to serve as priests. So they're going to stand as mediators between God and the rest of the world. So that means they're going to mediate the blessings of God to the rest of the world, just like God promised Abraham his family would do, as well as mediating the blessings of the world back to God. And so I think we have a quote here on the next slide from David Bellman that expresses this better than I could. He says, by being a nation that is distinct and set apart from pagan nations, a holy nation, the Israelites would mediate Yahweh's blessing to and intention for all nations, a kingdom of priests. So this is the context for Israel, but at this point, they're still in the wilderness. They're making this agreement with God at Sinai, which is in the wilderness. And so they need to get into the land that God promised to them to become a nation, that they can shine as a light to the other nations. And so in Joshua, the book right before Judges, they're making this conquest into the land that God has promised for them. And at the very end of Joshua, Joshua poses this kind of question to the people of Israel. I think we've got it on the next slide there. He says, "But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord." And sort of in this section of Joshua, there's like 3 repetitions that the people have, where they're like, we're going to serve the Lord. So then kind of the question that we're left with as we end Joshua and we jump into Judges is, are they going to do that? Are they going to follow through on their promise and serve the Lord in the land? As we've been seeing through the first 16 chapters of Judges, not so much. So we have this really grim ending here at the end of Judges, these really dark chapters, which if you didn't get a chance to read it, I do suggest that you do. It's not easy reading, but I think that's the point. And so we're going to talk about it today, and talking about it can be good to help explain it. But I think these are chapters of the Bible that you really need to read and experience, because there's a real weight to the depravity and the atrocities that happen here that can't just be talked about, but they have to be felt for the full impact to come through. And so I'm going to try to communicate as well as I can today the point of these chapters of Judges, why they're even in the Bible at all, what we can glean from them. But I'd encourage you, if you haven't already, go back through and read Judges in one sitting. You can probably do it in an hour and a half or something out loud. Not too long to read. And yeah, although it's a pretty dark book to read, it also sets us up, as we've seen the other books set up Judges. Judges is setting us up to continue to anticipate a resolution to the bad ending that it sets us up on. So I'd encourage you to read those chapters, but we're going to do the overview of those. So the question is, what is the point of Judges 17 through 21? So we're going to look at kind of 3 different layers. Like, we're going to move from kind of a macro level to a more micro level to get an idea of what these chapters in the Bible are all about, why they're even here. So first one that we're going to look at is just the intentional design of the book. Where does Judges 17:21 fall in the design of the book, and what does that tell us about what it's about? Second one we're going to look at is a repeated refrain that comes up throughout this section of the Bible, this section of Judges. Repetition is a good sign that something's important, so we're going to look at this repeated refrain that tells us what these chapters in particular are about. Then finally, we're going to look at one literary allusion that's made, although there's lots of them that make the same point, but one particular literary allusion that's made in one story from this section that tells us a little bit about what's going on here. So, step number 1 is the literary design, which is all about cycles and spirals. So, as Pastor John has reminded us many times, the book of Judges is set up with these cycles of self-destruction. So we have this repeated cycle throughout Judges where the people turn away from God, then they become oppressed by another nation, they cry out in their oppression, God raises up a deliverer. In response, the deliverer saves them, and then there's rest and peace for a little while, but eventually the people repeat the cycle all over again. But it's not just a story of a cycle, it's a cycle that moves in a downward spiral. And so in this first section of the book, we get sort of the inciting incident or the principal cause. Like, what is it that set off this whole downward spiral? So that's what we get in the first little section of Judges, is that they didn't complete the conquest. And we even see signs of the fact that there's sort of already this downward trajectory in the way that that story is told, that each subsequent tribe from Judah down to Dan does less and less of their job. So it's like, okay, things are getting worse and worse in the way that it's laid out. Then we get that continued sort of things are getting worse and worse in the stories of the Judges that we've been looking at. So we've got this worsening effect, this deterioration that Israel is going through that continues all the way through the Judges. So it goes from, I wouldn't quite call it good, but like okay, maybe, to bad to ugly. And then the end of Judges, where we're going to look at today, is kind of just like the crash out. Like, the cycle that we've been going through isn't part of the literary design anymore. We just leave that behind, and it's just like everything's just ugly. This is sort of like the end of the line, the rock bottom that we hit at the end of the downward spiral. And so how do we know that Judges is a downward spiral? Because to me, I'm like, okay, a lot of scholars say that this section of Judges 3 through 16 is a downward spiral, but to me, it kind of seems like all these judges aren't doing very well. Like, was Samson really that much worse than Jephthah? I don't know. They seem both like they're kind of bad to me, but a really great clue that we only get if we pay really close attention to the fact that the author's trying to set us up to see that there's a deterioration happening is in the elements of the cycle that are missing from different points. So I think on the next slide, we've got a table here. So there's these different elements of the cycle that get repeated over and over again, except at some points they don't get repeated. And so you can see there in the red that slowly there's parts of the cycle that aren't happening. And so in particular, we see that there's kind of some ambiguity about whether it was God who raised up some of the judges. It's not directly said. And in the case of Jephthah, it's like made explicit that it's the people who choose Jephthah. And then we also get, I kind of think the key thing is that in the last two cycles especially, there's no rest for the land after God raises up the deliverer. So in all the other cycles, God raises up the deliverer, and then there's a period of rest for the land, maybe 40 years where it's like, okay, everything's good, there's peace. But in these last two judges, Jephthah and Samson, we don't get that resolution, right? There's no rest that comes. So this is kind of one, there's lots of different clues, but this is one clue that shows us we're on this downward trajectory, and it's moving to getting worse. So that's one function of this section of the book of Judges, is just that its place in the literary design tells us this is kind of showing us what it looks like to hit rock bottom. This is the worst that it gets. Point number two is that there's a repeated refrain in this section of Judges. So we kick things off in Judges 17:6 with a little kind of introduction to this character Micah, but then we get the first instance of this refrain that gets repeated 4 times. And that's that everyone's doing what's right in their own eyes. So think Genesis 3, right? Eve sees what's good with her eyes and decides to take it. We even talked about that last week, that design pattern with Samson going on, that he was seeing what was good with his own eyes and doing and acting accordingly instead of trusting God's wisdom. So people are doing what is good in their own eyes instead of doing what's good in God's eyes, and that there was no king in the land. So this phrase that comes up in verse 6 of chapter 17 comes up again at the beginning of chapter 18:1, comes up again in chapter 19, both of those in abbreviated form, and then it's the very last verse of Judges as well, chapter 21, verse 25. So the fact that this is repeated over and over again probably tells us it's important, especially in a culture where like they didn't have Microsoft Word and you can just type as many words as you want. It was expensive to produce a scroll and it took a lot of time to write things down. So repetition is definitely something we should be keying in on. And so what we can glean then is that the author thinks that it's really important that with this section of the book that we're understanding that what it's primarily about is that this is what happens when people do what's good in their own eyes instead of doing what's good in God's eyes. And so, here we have sort of an example of what happens when God isn't king. So there's maybe some different interpretations about what it means to repeat that there was no king in the land. Some people think, is this sort of like saying like a pro-monarchy thing for Israel, like we needed kings like David and Solomon and stuff. I think a better argument is that the problem here is that God isn't king. And so if we look, I think we've got a verse for 1 Samuel chapter 8 up there. Yeah, perfect. So this is from the next book, Samuel, where the people of Israel are going to pick up a king. And like, spoiler alert, but the rest of the Hebrew Bible is like the kings didn't fix the problem. The prophets are going to tell us they're just as bad as the judges pretty much, have the same issue. But God's talking to Samuel here about the people's desire to have a human king, and he says to him, listen to all that the people are saying to you. It's not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king. And so I think that the author of Judges is trying to tell us something similar, that this is what happens when a culture, when a people decides that God is no longer king, that now we reign over our own lives, and that God no longer has the authority or the sovereignty over every area of our life to determine how we ought to live. So this is what happens to Israel. this is kind of the point of this section of the book. And I think it's a a statement that applies to us as well. I think of Nietzsche's like God is dead, right? Like that defines our culture in so many ways. Like we're living in much the same way, a culture of moral relativism where you just do what's right to you, right? So I think there's a lot for us to learn from this, but we'll get to more of that a little bit later. Point number 3 is about a particular literary allusion. So what this literary allusion is going to tell us is that the people of God at this rock bottom, they've hit this rock bottom because they no longer are acting as God, with God as their king. They're starting to do just what's right in their eyes instead of what's right in God's eyes. And what happens when they do that is that they become more and more like the Canaanites that they were supposed to displace from this land and that they're supposed to be different from, right? Their calling in Exodus 19 was to be a holy nation, to be set apart, to be like markedly different from the rest of the people so that they were around, so that they could be a light to these nations, to be like an example of what it looks like to live under the blessing of God. And so I think I've got a slide there that compares Genesis 19 and Judges 19. So we're not going to go into the gory details of this story because they are gory and they are atrocious. But you can see up there, there's a lot of resonance between this story from Genesis 19, which is a story of Sodom and Gomorrah. So if you're unfamiliar with this story, there's a nephew or a relative of Abraham, Lot, who's living in this place, Sodom and Gomorrah, and God is about to destroy these cities because of their wickedness. They're just, way too perverse and evil, and so God's going to destroy these cities. But Lot is the one righteous person there and his family, so God sends angels to go get him to leave the city before it gets destroyed so that he can be saved. So we got this story about like a city that's just kind of the epitome of everything that's awful with humanity. It's like this archetype from the book of Genesis about like Sodom and Gomorrah, like those are like the bad cities. Like that's who you don't want to be. It's like right up there with Babylon and Egypt and Nineveh and stuff, right? Like Sodom and Gomorrah is bad. So then we have this story in Judges 19 where this Israelite guy is on his way back home and he stops by a Canaanite city, or it's like on his way home, and he goes, I don't want to stay there. Like, I don't think it's going to be safe for me to stay there. Like, the hospitality is probably going to be bad. It might be dangerous. I'm going to go to this Israelite city, Gibeah, instead. And so he stays there in Gibeah, and if you've read the story, you know that it's awful, and there's a deep irony to the fact that he didn't want to go to the Canaanite city because what happens in the Israelite city is like just as bad, if not worse, than what happened in Sodom and Gomorrah. And we get this picture of, man, the Israelites have become just as bad as Sodom and Gomorrah, if not worse. Like they've become exactly like the kind of people that they were supposed to be a blessing to. And so what ends up happening in this book is that we get this picture of the Canaanites, and I think I've got a quote here from David Beldman as being basically the same as the Israelites. It says, over the course of the book, the Israelites increasingly become their own enemies. The Israelites have become to each other Canaanites. And so over the course of this book, we just see progressively the people of Israel acting less and less like the people that they were called to be and more like the people that they were called to be a light to. And so what ends up happening is that when the people of Israel and Judges reject God's rule, it not only brings destruction upon themselves, like they cease to just flourish and function as human beings, as a human society, and there's this ironic reversal at the end of this section where the people are actually like doing a conquest against themselves. They're destroying each other, which is just like the total opposite of what they're supposed to be doing, right? They're supposed to be a blessing to the nations, but instead they become a curse to themselves. And so there's this aspect of it that like when we aren't following God's instructions for our lives, when we aren't living the way that he wants us to, when we're trying to reign and rule over our own lives, it actually ends up like destroying us. But then it also totally undermines their ability to live out their function and their calling as a nation, right? Like thinking back to the big context, this is all about God's plan to rescue the whole world, and he's going to do it through Abraham and his family. But the people of Israel have failed so utterly that like they can't even be a blessing to the nations. They can't even be a blessing to each other, right? They're killing each other. They're leading conquests against certain tribes. There's just horrible things that they're doing to each other. They're treating each other like Canaanites treat one another. And so it's this really sad section in the story of Israel where it's like everything has gone so utterly wrong when Israel has rejected God as king in this way. So just got a concluding statement kind of to answer the question, what is this book all about? I think on the next slide there, Ruben, that by turning from God as their king, Israel has hit a rock bottom of self-destruction that also compromises their mission to be a blessing to the nations. So back now to our initial question about rest. This is just one area in which I think we can contemplate how this applies to our life. At the end of the Judges cycle, we talked a little bit about how there's this motif that doesn't get repeated in the last two Judges of there's rest for the land. There's this idea of like the goal that everything's pointing towards is that there's like a deep flourishing and peace in the land, that like everything is set right in the land, that we're like pointing back to that Genesis 2 ideal of God resting in his creation where everything is good. And we're not getting that in Judges. And so I think maybe if we're honest with ourselves, we can see a similar thing going on in our world today, that we're restless. We also have that final element of the cycle missing from our lives, that we're not necessarily people of rest, that we're not fully leaning into and living into the good life that God has on offer for us. And so we're finding that ourselves, we're not flourishing as human beings, but then also the sad consequence of that is that it compromises our witness, right? If we're meant to be a contrast community for the sake of the world, a people who actually live out and embody and witness to a different way of being in the world, and that's attractive to other people, but we're not living that way, and we're living just like our neighbors. We're just as stressed out and over busy and overtired and exhausted as they are, and we're not doing anything about that, then that really takes away from our witness. Like, right? Like, follow Jesus like me. You'll be stressed out and tired all the time. Like, okay, well, that doesn't seem like great news, but I don't know, right? So, point being that, we don't have gods like Baal or Asherah that we worship in our culture, but there are other gods that compromise our allegiance to God, that compromise our ability to be a holy nation and a kingdom of priests for the sake of the world. And when we cut ourselves off from the commands of God, right, as the children's story articulated so well, like the commands of God are meant to lead us into life and blessing. They're not meant to be these burdens on us. But when we cut ourselves off from experiencing the blessing of God by not following his way of life, we're also cutting ourselves off from living out our full potential and being able to be a blessing to other people as well. And so, there's lots of different things that can work to compromise our allegiance to God, our kingship to God, and in particular, our ability to rest. And so, there's lots of different practices that we can take from Jesus, that we can take from the wisdom of Scripture that can help us to become people of rest, that can help us to combat this frenetic pace of our culture and the exhaustion that comes with it. I think the obvious one that stands out to me is the practice of Sabbath, right? There's debate within the church whether or not this is still a binding commandment for followers of Jesus, but I think it's a little bit of an irrelevant question whether or not it's something like we have to do. It's like Sabbath is something that we get to do. This is something that God's inviting us into, is to take one 24-hour period out of every 7 days and to just stop. To stop what we're doing, to let go of all of our striving, and to actually legitimately rest. And so I want to just encourage you to adopt this practice of Sabbath into your life as a way of combating the restlessness and the gods and the idols of our day, living differently from the people of our culture, and ultimately not to just check a box of like, I did the Sabbath, but to begin to be transformed into a person of rest, into a person who isn't hurried and exhausted, who seems to have a peace and a rest about them, that you can witness to and share that with with others in the world. And so, I think there's a few things that maybe keep us from rest. There's a few idols in our culture that keep us from wanting to practice the Sabbath. There's a lot of resistance. Like, it's not easy to just say, I'm going to stop for 24 hours, right? Like, when I was in university, I didn't ever take a Sabbath because I was like, I just have homework to do. And it was important to me. And it obviously didn't necessarily lead to my complete flourishing, as I was sharing earlier, right? And getting sick all the time. But I think to name some of these gods that threaten our ability to obey God's commands and do what's right in his eyes instead of ours, there's maybe achievement, right? Where, like, maybe for you is like me in school, I'm like, I have to, get an A+ on every single paper. I can't just be happy with a B or something, right? Like, maybe there's some kind of achievement that you're striving after. Like, I need that title in my work or that promotion or something, or, I need to prove to my peers and my friends that, like, I can have success in whatever that looks like to the world. Maybe another one is wealth, right? Maybe it's just greed for more, or maybe it's a fear of not having enough that drives us to just continue working, to put in those extra hours, to do that extra work, that extra job that's going to make us a little bit more money because we're looking to money as our God, as our source of security and safety, right? It's like, this is what's going to give me the good life. This is what's going to keep me safe when storms come, is having enough financial security to bear it all. And so, maybe what's stopping us from experiencing Sabbath rest is that we're like, I just have to work too hard. Maybe it's just a general consumerism. Maybe it's like, I can't actually stop. Maybe I can stop working, but like, I can't stop just consuming all of these things that actually keep me restless. Like, I'm not actually stopping and resting in who God is because I have such an insatiable desire to just continue, scrolling social media feeds or watching Netflix or whatever it is that keeps me from really resting, that kind of restless, like, okay, I'm looking for the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, instead of just stopping and enjoying God and enjoying his world. Like, I think there's lots of these competing visions of the good life that can keep us from really resting, right? Like, we have these ideas, this is going to make me happy. Like, oh, I'm going to do these purely cosmetic renovations because having a nicer looking bathroom is going to make me happy. And so I'm working every Sunday on these renovations and never getting any rest just because I saw this cool looking bathroom on Instagram and thought that was going to make me happy, right? Like, these are the kinds of things that keep us from experiencing Sabbath rest. And so my challenge for you today is to begin to practice the Sabbath if you haven't already, or if you do practice the Sabbath, to continue to practice the Sabbath, to be encouraged in doing that with intentionality in order to combat these false gods. And so I've got a few quotes here that I think succinctly kind of put a little bit about what the Sabbath is all about in the Bible, like why even practice the Sabbath, into words better than I could choose. So if you don't mind pulling those up, Ruben. I think one's from, I think the next slide maybe. Yeah, so we've got Matisyahu Savat here says, 1 day out of 7, the Israelite is to renounce dominion over his own time and recognize God's dominion over it. Simply put, every 7th day, the Israelite renounces his autonomy and affirms God's dominion over him. Keeping the Sabbath is an acceptance of the kingdom and sovereignty of God. And so what happens when we just stop on a day, right? Like, you think particularly back to like an ancient Israelite, like you're trying to, you're living like subsistence living, like day to day. I don't know if there's going to be food on the table necessarily. Like, to stop and just not work is like a huge act of trust in God. And maybe we don't have the exact same situation as them, but it is a similar situation where it's like, I'm going to stop and just recognize with this day that I don't actually have control over my time. Like, my time doesn't belong to me. I was created for a purpose. I exist for a reason, and my time actually belongs to God. And so it's a day to actually, like, I mean, we can imagine that, we can think that and say, oh yeah, I believe that's true, but is it actually our deep conviction when 7 days of the week we're not living like it's true? So practicing Sabbath is like taking a stand on 1 day of the week to say, okay, I'm dedicating myself to remembering this day that I belong to God, that my time belongs to him. And the point then being that that's supposed to seep into the way then that I live the rest of my life. That the other 6 days of the week, I'm remembering now that my time belongs to God, not to me. That I'm not autonomous, but I actually belong to God. And I think I have a quote here from Walter Brueggemann as well that puts it nicely. He says, Israel is always again to re-choose between life and death, between Yahweh and the gods of your ancestors, between Yahweh and Baal, between the way of the Torah and the way of sinners. Sabbath becomes a decisive, concrete, visible way of opting for and aligning with the God of rest. And so in practicing Sabbath, again, we're making a statement that, to the world as well as to ourselves, that we're trusting God, that we are aligning ourselves with this God of rest, that it's, like he says, it's a decisive, concrete, and visible way of opting for this, right? So it's not just like, in theory, I believe this is true, but I'm not actually doing it in practice. This is a practice that can help us. And so, I'm not trying to say that Sabbath is like the silver bullet solution to everything. Like, if the people in Judges had just practiced Sabbath, none of that would have ever happened. It's just one of the many commands that God has given to his people in order for them to flourish. But I think it's a really important one in our day and age, because that kind of chronic restlessness and that culture of like 24/7 go, go, go is so pervasive. Like, I think it's interesting that some of the occupations that have like the highest amount of burnout and people just continuing to work overtime and more hours is like, I think pastors is in the top 3, which isn't a slight at Pastor John. He's actually such a great role model to me of Sabbath rest on sabbatical right now. Way to go. But in general, it shows like, here's like something that seeped so deeply into the culture of the church that like pastors are actually some of the worst at this. That like we really need to consider, like, as the church in North America, are we living in a way that's different from the rest of the world, that shows like attractively to them, like, hey, this is what it looks like to rest, to actually just be content with and enjoy the life that God's given me, instead of endlessly striving for more, to trust God, to live like, trusting in his sovereignty instead of feeling like I have to be sovereign over my life and be in control of everything. And so, really simple practice that I'm going to extend the invitation for you to adopt this week, with the promise that we're going to talk a little bit more about this next week, dive a little bit deeper into what it looks like to practice the Sabbath maybe. But for this first week, I just want to encourage you to pick a time. So I think I've got the last slide there, perfect, to pick a time to stop and rest. So maybe Sunday doesn't work super well for you to be the day that you take a Sabbath rest, to be the 24 hours that you set apart. But I'd encourage you to find some time. And maybe 24 hours like right away, trying this for the first time maybe it doesn't work for you, but like take as much time as you can to start, right? Like maybe it's 12 hours, maybe it's 10 hours. Just take a time out of your week. Try to find a time that's going to work for you every week to just stop doing what you're doing and to rest. And then in the blue there, I've got kind of an optional, like if you want to go above and beyond here on this week and not just do number 1, you can pick a starting and an ending ritual to mark out the day. So this is just something that I've found really helpful to kind of mark the fact that this isn't just another day that I'm waking up, but I'm actually being intentional about doing the Sabbath today, that I'm actually being intentional about really resting, about really stopping, about remembering that God is sovereign over my life, about anticipating the future rest to come, is just pick some kind of ritual to start the day and to end the day that's going to help put you in that frame of mind. So maybe it's you want to light a candle and read a psalm. Maybe you want to do, the traditional Sabbath and start at sundown and start with like a dinner and enjoy the time with your family or with friends or something as a way of marking the beginning of this, and then the same kind of thing at the end. So it's just a suggestion for you to help really mark and set aside this time as not just another day of my weekend, but like this is really a day that I'm setting aside as special to the Lord. But it's my encouragement to you. I think if we want to avoid similar fate to the people of Judges, where at least less than ideally performing our vocation as the people of God on the mission of God, who are meant to be a witness to the world of the good news, then Sabbath is something that we need to rediscover, that we need to commit to ourselves to, even in the face of all the resistance that we're going to face from without and from within. So I just like to close us in prayer as you begin to consider what it might look like for you to continue to practice Sabbath or begin practicing it for the first time. Lord, we thank you that you are a God of rest, that you are a God who has our best in mind, that you desire for us to be whole, flourishing human beings, not to be stretched thin and fractured and less than what we were made to be, but that you have so much wisdom for us in your word, in the way of Jesus, that we can even now begin to experience some of that good news tangibly, the good life here and now, as we anticipate its full realization to come in the future. And so I pray for us this morning, God, that you would help us to rest, that you would help to, just put aside our worries and our fears and our commitments that keep us from resting, God, that you would help us to continue to persist when it's difficult to practice Sabbath rest, and to find delight and joy in Sabbath rest and in this practice, and to have a desire to share you and the goodness that comes with following you with the rest of the world. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, now is the time in our service